The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Fort Stockton, Texas, and Vincent Morgan had seen enough suffering in his 32 years to recognize it from 100 yards away. The woman knelt in the dirt behind the old mercantile, her faded blue dress torn at the hem and dusty from travel, breaking apart what looked like the last piece of bread she owned to feed a mangy dog that could barely stand on its skeletal legs. Vincent had been loading supplies onto his wagon when he noticed her. The way she moved with such gentle purpose, despite the hollow look in her own eyes that spoke of days without proper food. The dog, some mix of shepherd and Lord knew what else, pressed its nose into her palm with desperate gratitude, and Vincent watched the woman smile despite the tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. He did not call out or announce himself. Vincent simply walked over, his boots crunching in the dry earth, and when she looked up at him with startled green eyes that held more wariness than hope, he reached down and scooped up the trembling dog in his arms. The woman scrambled to her feet, perhaps thinking he meant to harm the animal, but Vincent just tilted his head toward his wagon and said the only words that mattered in that moment. "Come on." She hesitated, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her dress, and Vincent could see her weighing her options the way someone does when they have run out of good choices and are left with only the lesser of evils. He was a stranger, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that had been hardened by sun and circumstance. She had no reason to trust him, and they both knew it. But the dog whimpered in his arms, and Vincent waited with the patience of a man who understood that sometimes kindness had to prove itself through action rather than words. After a long moment, the woman nodded once and followed him to the wagon, her steps uncertain but determined. Vincent settled the dog gently in the wagon bed on an old blanket, then helped the woman up onto the bench seat before climbing up beside her and taking the reins. He did not ask her name, or where she came from, or what series of misfortunes had left her feeding her last meal to a dying dog. Those questions could wait. Right now, what mattered was getting them both out to his ranch where there was food and water and a safe place to rest. The ride took most of an hour, and the woman sat stiffly beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as they traveled through the harsh landscape of West Texas in the summer of 1882. The drought had been brutal that year, turning the already unforgiving land even more inhospitable, and Vincent knew that anyone traveling alone through this territory without proper supplies was risking death by exposure, if not worse. His ranch sat in a small valley where a creek still ran with enough water to keep his cattle alive and his land from turning completely to dust. It was not much compared to the big spreads further north, but it was his, earned through years of hard work and careful management. The house was modest, built from stone and timber with a wide porch that offered shade during the worst heat of the day. Vincent pulled the wagon up to the barn first, lifting the dog down carefully while the woman climbed down on her own, still maintaining that careful distance. He carried the animal to the barn where it was cooler, settling it on a pile of clean straw before fetching water and some scraps of salted beef from his stores. The dog drank weakly, its tail making a feeble attempt at wagging, and Vincent ran his hands over its ribs, assessing. "He has been starving for weeks," Vincent said quietly, glancing up at the woman who hovered in the doorway, backlit by the harsh afternoon sun. "But I think we can bring him back if we are careful with the feeding. Too much too fast will kill him." "Thank you," she whispered, and her voice cracked on the words. "I found him 2 days ago on the road. I could not just leave him." Vincent nodded, understanding that completely. He stood and wiped his hands on his trousers, then gestured toward the house. "You need food, too, and water. Come inside." This time she followed without hesitation, perhaps because he had been gentle with the dog, or perhaps because she was simply too exhausted to maintain her guard any longer. Vincent led her into the kitchen, a simple room with a wood stove and a sturdy table, and pulled out a chair for her. She sank into it gratefully, and he could see now how young she was, probably no more than 23 or 24, with honey-colored hair that had escaped from its pins and freckles across her nose that spoke of Irish ancestry. He pumped water from the kitchen pump, filling a clean glass and setting it in front of her, then slicing bread and cheese while she drank. Vincent had learned to cook for himself after his mother passed 5 years back. Nothing fancy but good solid food, and he put together a simple meal while the woman watched him with those cautious green eyes. "Eat slowly," he advised as he set the plate before her. "Same as the dog. Your stomach needs time to adjust." She nodded and picked up the bread with trembling fingers, taking small, careful bites even though he could see she wanted to devour it all at once. Vincent busied himself at the stove, giving her privacy to eat, and put coffee on to boil. The familiar domestic tasks settled something in his chest, the simple act of caring for someone in need reminding him that there was still goodness possible in a world that often seemed determined to grind people down to dust. When she had finished eating, moving with more restraint than he would have thought possible for someone so clearly starving, Vincent poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from her at the table. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. "I am Vincent Morgan," he said simply. "This is my ranch, Sarah Catherine," she replied, her voice stronger now with food and water in her. "Sarah Kimball. Where are you from, Sarah?" Her hands tightened around the coffee cup, and he saw the walls go up again in her eyes. "St. Louis originally, but I have been traveling for 3 months now." Vincent waited, letting the silence stretch between them, and eventually Sarah continued, the words spilling out as if a dam had broken. "My father died last winter. He was all I had left after my mother passed when I was young. He had debts I did not know about, and when he was gone, the creditors came for everything. The house, the furniture, even my mother's jewelry. I had a small amount of money saved, enough for a ticket west and some supplies. I thought I could find work, maybe as a teacher or a seamstress. But every town I stopped in, there were a dozen other women with the same idea, and the work that was available was not the kind of work I could do." She met his eyes then, and Vincent saw the fierce pride there, the determination that had kept her going even when everything else was stripped away. "I will not sell myself," Sarah said flatly. "I would rather starve." "No one is asking you to," Vincent replied calmly, "and you will not starve here." "I cannot accept charity," Sarah protested, setting down her coffee cup with a soft clink. "I need to work to earn my keep. I will not be a burden." Vincent considered her for a long moment, seeing the stubborn set of her jaw and the way she held herself despite her obvious exhaustion. He respected that, the refusal to simply accept handouts, the need to maintain dignity even in desperate circumstances. "I need help around the ranch," he said finally. "The house needs cleaning, and I am a poor cook at best. The garden has gone to weeds because I do not have time to tend it properly. If you want to work, there is plenty to do. Room and board, and we can discuss wages once you are settled." Sarah studied him, searching his face for any hint of deception or ulterior motive, and Vincent met her gaze steadily. He was not a man given to complicated schemes or hidden agendas. What he offered was exactly what he said, nothing more and nothing less. "All right," Sarah agreed quietly. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan." "Vincent," he corrected. "We are not formal out here." "Vincent," she repeated, and he liked the way his name sounded in her voice, soft with gratitude but still maintaining that core of strength. He showed her to the spare bedroom, a small, simple space with a narrow bed and a chest of drawers that had belonged to his mother. Sarah stood in the doorway looking at the clean sheets and the window with its faded curtains as if she had been offered a room in a palace, and Vincent felt something twist in his chest at the sight. "Rest," he told her. "We can sort everything else out tomorrow." But Sarah shook her head, already pulling the pins from her hair and twisting it back into a more practical arrangement. "Show me where things are. I would rather be useful." So Vincent gave her the tour, showing her the kitchen stores and the root cellar, the chicken coop out back where a dozen hens scratched in the dirt, the garden that did indeed need serious attention. Sarah absorbed it all with sharp intelligence, asking practical questions about his routines and preferences. And by the time the sun began to set, she had already started organizing the kitchen with an efficiency that spoke of a woman who knew how to run a household. Vincent went out to check on the dog, finding the animal sleeping more peacefully now with food and water in its belly. He gave it a little more to eat, just a small amount, then tended to his own evening chores, feeding the horses and checking the cattle. The work was familiar and grounding, and it gave him time to think about the strange turn his day had taken. He had not been looking for company. After his mother died, Vincent had grown accustomed to the solitude of ranch life, finding peace in the simple rhythms of work and the quiet of his own thoughts. There had been women over the years, a few brief courtships that never quite took root, and he had resigned himself to the likelihood of remaining a bachelor. At 32, he was set in his ways, comfortable with his routines. But something about Sarah had struck him the moment he saw her kneeling in the dirt, breaking her last piece of bread to feed a starving dog. It was not just her beauty, though she was lovely in a natural, understated way, but the compassion in that act, the selflessness of it. In his experience, people who showed kindness to animals in their own moment of desperation were the sort of people worth knowing. When Vincent returned to the house, he found that Sarah had cleaned the kitchen, put together a simple supper of beans and cornbread, and set the table for two. She looked up when he entered, and he caught a glimpse of uncertainty in her expression, as if she feared she had overstepped. "This looks good," Vincent said, washing his hands at the pump. "Thank you." They ate together as the last light faded from the sky, talking about small practical things, carefully avoiding the deeper questions that hung between them. Sarah told him she was 23, had been educated at a small private school in St. Louis, and knew how to keep books as well as a house. Vincent talked about the ranch, the challenges of the drought, his plans for expanding the herd if the weather cooperated. It was easy conversation, comfortable in a way that surprised him, and when they finished eating, Sarah insisted on washing the dishes while Vincent saw to the evening banking of the stove. They moved around the kitchen together with an unexpected synchronicity, and Vincent found himself noticing small things. The way Sarah hummed softly as she worked, the graceful movements of her hands, the way the lamplight caught gold in her hair. "I should check on the dog before bed," Sarah said when the kitchen was clean, and Vincent fetched a lantern to light their way to the barn. The animal was awake, its eyes brighter than they had been that afternoon, and its tail thumped weakly when Sarah knelt beside it, running her hand over its head. "You are going to be all right," she murmured to the dog. "We both are. He needs a name," Vincent observed, crouching down beside her. "Cannot just keep calling him Dog." Sarah smiled, the first real smile he had seen from her, and it transformed her face entirely. "What about Lucky? Because he was lucky we found him." "We were all lucky today, I think," Vincent said quietly. And when Sarah looked at him, he saw something shift in her expression, a softening of the wariness she had carried since he first approached her. They returned to the house together, and Vincent showed Sarah how to bar the door for the night, where he kept the rifle if there was trouble, though he assured her that trouble was rare this far from town. She bid him good night with shy formality, and Vincent retreated to his own room, lying awake longer than usual, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving through his house, the creak of floorboards and the soft closing of a door. The next morning, Vincent woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, luxuries he had not experienced since his mother's death, and found Sarah already up and dressed, preparing breakfast with calm efficiency. They fell into an easy routine over the following days, Vincent working the ranch while Sarah tackled the house and garden with determined energy. She was tireless in her efforts, scrubbing floors and mending curtains, coaxing the neglected garden back to life with careful watering and weeding. Lucky recovered slowly under their combined care, gaining weight and strength until he could walk around the yard, though he never strayed far from Sarah's side, as if understanding that she had saved his life. Vincent found himself looking forward to the end of each workday, to coming back to the house and finding Sarah there, her face flushed from the heat of the stove or smudged with dirt from the garden, always with a smile for him and a question about his day. They ate their evening meals together, talking more freely now, sharing stories from their pasts and opinions about everything from politics to the best way to make biscuits. Sarah had a sharp wit and a love of reading that matched his own, and Vincent took to bringing books back from town when he went for supplies, watching her face light up when he presented her with a new novel or collection of poetry. She read to him sometimes in the evenings, her voice bringing life to the words, and Vincent would sit in his chair, ostensibly mending tack or going over his account books, but mostly just listening to the sound of her voice and feeling something he had not felt in years: contentment. Weeks passed, and the summer heat began to ease slightly as August gave way to September. Vincent paid Sarah her wages, insisting despite her protests that she had more than earned them, and watched as she carefully folded the money away in a small box she kept in her room. He knew she was saving, planning for a future that might take her away from his ranch, and the thought bothered him more than he cared to admit. One evening in early September, Vincent returned from checking the north pasture to find Sarah sitting on the porch steps with Lucky's head in her lap, her face troubled. He sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and waited. "I had a letter from St. Louis today," Sarah said quietly. "You remember I mentioned my father's debts?" Vincent nodded, worry tightening his chest. "There was an investigation. Apparently, the man who claimed my father owed him money was a fraud. He had no legitimate claim to our property. The courts have ruled in my favor, and what remains of my father's estate is being held for me. It is not much, but it is something." "That is good news," Vincent said carefully, trying to read her expression in the fading light. "It means I have options now," Sarah continued, still not looking at him. "I could go back to St. Louis, or I could use the money to go somewhere else, start fresh somewhere new." The words hung between them, heavy with implication, and Vincent felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He had known this moment was coming, had known that Sarah would not stay indefinitely as his housekeeper, but he had not prepared himself for how much the thought of her leaving would hurt. "Is that what you want?" he asked, keeping his voice level. "To leave?" Sarah finally turned to look at him, and in her eyes he saw the same confusion and longing that he felt churning in his own chest. "I do not know what I want," she admitted. "A month ago, I was starving in the street, feeding my last piece of bread to a dying dog. You took us both in without question, without judgment. You gave me safety and work and dignity when I had none of those things. How do I know what I want when everything has changed so completely?" Vincent reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. Her fingers were work roughened now from the garden and the housework, no longer the soft hands of a city woman, and he rubbed his thumb across her knuckles gently. "I know what I want," he said quietly. "I want you to stay, not as my housekeeper, Sarah. I want you to stay as my wife." She drew in a sharp breath, her eyes widening, and Vincent pressed on before he could lose his courage. "I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other a few months, but I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. You are strong and kind and good, and when I come home at the end of the day, all I want is to see your face. I do not want to eat supper alone anymore. I do not want to wake up in an empty house. I want to build a life with you if you will have me." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks, catching the last rays of sunlight, and for a moment, Vincent feared he had misread everything, that she would refuse and leave, and he would spend the rest of his life regretting this moment. But then Sarah squeezed his hand tightly and said in a voice choked with emotion, "Yes, yes, Vincent, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her close while Lucky wagged his tail and pressed against their legs, and Vincent felt something settle deep in his soul, a rightness he had been searching for without knowing it. Sarah wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face against his shoulder, and they stayed like that for a long time, holding on to each other as the sun set, and the stars began to emerge in the vast Texas sky. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony in Fort Stockton, with the local minister officiating and a few of Vincent's neighboring ranchers standing as witnesses. Sarah wore a new dress that Vincent had insisted on buying for her, a soft blue that matched her eyes, and she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that she had picked herself that morning. Vincent wore his best suit, the one he usually reserved for funerals and the occasional trip to a bigger city, and tried not to let his hands shake as he slipped a simple gold band onto Sarah's finger. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Vincent kissed Sarah for the first time, he felt as if everything in his life had been leading to this moment. They held a small celebration at the ranch that evening, the neighbors bringing food and well wishes, and Vincent watched Sarah move through the crowd with easy grace, laughing and talking with the other women, already becoming part of the community. She caught his eye across the yard and smiled, a private smile just for him, and Vincent felt his chest swell with pride and love and gratitude for whatever providence had led her to his town on that brutal summer day. When the guests finally departed and they were alone, Vincent carried Sarah across the threshold of what was now truly their home, and she laughed, her arms tight around his neck. He set her down gently in the front room, and suddenly, the easy companionship they had built over the past months was complicated by new expectations and new intimacy. Sarah seemed to sense his nervousness, and she took his hand, leading him toward the bedroom that had been his alone but would now be theirs to share. "I am a little frightened," she admitted softly, looking up at him with honest eyes. "But I trust you, Vincent. I trust you more than I have ever trusted anyone." "I will never hurt you," Vincent promised, cupping her face in his hands and kissing her forehead, her cheeks, finally her lips. "Never, Sarah, I swear it." They came together slowly that night, learning each other with gentle exploration. And if there was awkwardness, there was also tenderness and care and a growing passion that surprised them both. Vincent had been with women before, brief encounters that had satisfied physical needs but left him feeling hollow afterward, but this was different. This mattered in a way those other encounters never had, because Sarah mattered, because she was his wife and his partner, and the person he wanted to wake up beside for the rest of his life. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, Sarah's head on Vincent's chest while he ran his fingers through her unbound hair, and talked in whispers about their hopes and dreams for the future. Sarah wanted to expand the garden, maybe get some fruit trees started if they could find the right varieties for the climate. Vincent talked about increasing the herd, buying some better breeding stock, maybe building an addition onto the house if children came along. "You want children?" Sarah asked, tilting her head to look at him. "I do," Vincent admitted. "I always thought I would be a father someday, though I had given up on that dream before you came along. What about you?" Sarah smiled, tracing patterns on his chest with her fingertip. "I want children with you. A whole houseful, if we are blessed with them." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and Vincent woke in the early morning hours to find Sarah still beside him, her face peaceful in sleep, and marveled at how completely his life had changed in such a short time. The months that followed were the happiest of Vincent's life. He and Sarah settled into married life with an ease that felt miraculous, working together to run the ranch and build their future. Sarah's garden flourished under her care, providing fresh vegetables through the fall, and she spent her spare time learning to preserve and can, filling the root cellar with jars of beans and tomatoes and pickles for the winter ahead. Vincent taught her to ride, putting her on his gentlest mare and leading her around the corral until she gained confidence. And soon Sarah was riding out with him to check fence lines and move cattle, her face bright with joy at the freedom of it. She proved to be a quick learner and a hard worker, never complaining about the long hours or the harsh conditions, and Vincent found his respect for her growing daily alongside his love. Lucky thrived too, growing into a healthy, strong dog who appointed himself guardian of the ranch, barking at strangers but gentle as a lamb with Sarah. He slept on the porch at night, keeping watch, and followed Sarah everywhere during the day, content to lie in the shade while she worked in the garden or tended the chickens. Christmas came, and Vincent bought Sarah a beautiful shawl from the mercantile in Fort Stockton, soft wool in a deep green that brought out the color of her eyes. Sarah gave him a pair of leather work gloves she had saved up for practical but fine quality, and a book of poetry she had ordered special from a catalog. They celebrated quietly, just the two of them and Lucky, eating a fine meal Sarah had prepared and sitting by the fire, reading aloud to each other and talking about the year that had passed. "A year ago, I was in St. Louis, watching my father die," Sarah said softly, her head resting on Vincent's shoulder. "I could not have imagined then that I would be here now, so happy. It seems impossible that so much could change." "I am glad you are here," Vincent murmured, kissing the top of her head. "I am glad I saw you that day, feeding bread to a starving dog." Sarah laughed quietly. "I am glad you took us both in. You saved my life, Vincent. You saved both our lives." "You saved mine too," he replied seriously. "I did not realize how lonely I was until you were here, and then I could not imagine going back to the way things were before." Winter passed into spring, and in March, Sarah came to Vincent with news that made his heart soar. She was pregnant, due sometime in late October if the doctor's calculations were correct. Vincent swept her up in his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests, and immediately began planning all the things they would need to prepare. He built a cradle from oak, working on it in the evenings by lamplight, sanding it smooth and carving simple designs into the headboard. Sarah sewed baby clothes from soft fabric, tiny gowns and blankets, and organized the spare bedroom into a nursery. They talked endlessly about names, arguing good-naturedly over whether they hoped for a boy or a girl, though Vincent insisted he did not care as long as Sarah and the baby were healthy. As Sarah's belly grew, Vincent found himself becoming almost comically protective, insisting she rest more and work less, though Sarah laughed at his concern and continued with her usual routines, only slightly modified. She was healthy and strong, the doctor assured them, and the pregnancy was progressing normally. In late June, Vincent's nearest neighbor, a rancher named Thomas Wade who lived about 10 miles east, stopped by with troubling news. There had been rustlers working the area, hitting several ranches and making off with significant numbers of cattle. The local ranchers were organizing patrols, taking turns riding the boundaries of their properties to watch for suspicious activity. Vincent agreed to take his turn, though he hated leaving Sarah alone even for a few hours. She assured him she would be fine, that Lucky would bark if anyone approached, and that she had his rifle and knew how to use it. Still, Vincent rode out with a heavy heart, scanning the horizon constantly for any sign of trouble. The rustlers struck in late July, but not at Vincent's ranch. Thomas Wade lost nearly 100 head of cattle in a single night, and the thieves vanished into the vast, empty landscape before anyone could organize a pursuit. The loss was devastating for Wade, who ran a smaller operation than Vincent and could ill afford it. Vincent and Sarah talked it over and decided to lend Wade some of their own cattle to help him rebuild, a loan to be repaid when he could manage it. Wade was overwhelmed with gratitude, and Sarah insisted he stay for supper, feeding him a good meal and sending him home with a basket of preserves and fresh bread. Vincent watched his wife's easy compassion and generosity and fell in love with her all over again. As summer wore on, and Sarah's due date approached, Vincent found himself barely able to concentrate on his work, constantly worrying about whether she was all right, whether she needed anything. Sarah tolerated his hovering with patient amusement, shooing him out to tend to his chores and promising to call if she needed him. In mid-October, Sarah's labor began in the early morning hours, and Vincent rode like hell to fetch the doctor from Fort Stockton, then paced the front room like a caged animal while the doctor and a neighbor woman attended to his wife. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, and every cry from the bedroom made Vincent's heart clench with fear. But finally, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the baby's cry rang out, strong and healthy, and the neighbor woman emerged with a smile on her face. "You have a son, Mr. Morgan, a fine, healthy boy, and your wife is doing well." Vincent barely heard the rest of what she said, already pushing past her to get to Sarah. She lay propped up in bed, exhausted and pale but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she had made. Vincent approached slowly, almost reverently, and when Sarah pulled back the blanket to show him their son's face, he felt tears prick his eyes. The baby was perfect, small and red-faced with a surprising amount of dark hair, and when Vincent reached out to touch his son's tiny hand, the baby's fingers curled around his thumb with surprising strength. "What should we name him?" Sarah asked softly, looking up at Vincent with tired but joyful eyes. Vincent thought about his own father, a good man who had taught him the value of hard work and honest dealing before dying when Vincent was barely grown. "What about James? James Morgan. We could call him Jamie while he is small." "Jamie," Sarah repeated, trying it out. "I like that. Hello, Jamie. Welcome to the world, little one." Vincent spent that night sitting in a chair beside the bed, unable to sleep, just watching his wife and son rest, marveling at the miracle of them. In less than a year and a half, his entire life had transformed. He had gone from a lonely bachelor, resigned to a solitary existence, to a husband and father with a family to protect and provide for. Jamie proved to be a good baby, healthy and strong, nursing well and sleeping in reasonable stretches. Sarah recovered quickly from the birth, and soon the house was filled with the sounds of a baby's cries and gurgles, a new music that Vincent found he loved despite the interrupted sleep and constant needs. He took over more of the housework so Sarah could focus on the baby, and they worked together as a team, passing Jamie back and forth, taking turns soothing him when he fussed, celebrating every small milestone. Vincent discovered that fatherhood suited him, that he loved the weight of his son in his arms and the feeling of tiny fingers grasping his thumb. The years began to pass in a blur of seasons and growth. Jamie grew from infant to toddler to a sturdy little boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, curious and energetic, and full of questions. Sarah became pregnant again when Jamie was 2, delivering a daughter they named Rose, and then 2 years after that, another son they called Henry. The house was chaos most days, filled with the noise and energy of 3 young children, but it was a joyful chaos. Vincent built an addition onto the house as he had once dreamed of doing, adding 2 more bedrooms and expanding the kitchen. Sarah kept the household running with impressive efficiency, somehow managing to care for 3 children, maintain her garden, and still find time to read and talk with Vincent in the evenings after the little ones were asleep. Lucky grew old and gray around the muzzle, content to sleep on the porch and accept the children's sometimes clumsy affection. And when he finally passed away peacefully in his sleep when Jamie was 6, they buried him under a tree in Sarah's garden with a simple marker that read, "Lucky Faithful Friend." Jamie cried for days, and Vincent held his son and told him about how Lucky had come into their lives, starving and nearly dead, and how Sarah had saved him and in doing so had brought their whole family together. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness have the biggest consequences, Vincent told his son. Your mother fed a starving dog and look at what came from that. You and Rose and Henry, this whole life we have. Never underestimate the power of compassion, son. They got a new dog eventually, a puppy that the children named Scout, and life continued its steady forward motion. Vincent's ranch prospered, growing year by year until he was able to hire a few ranch hands to help with the work. Sarah became known throughout the area as a woman of intelligence and kindness, the person neighbors came to when they needed advice or help or just a sympathetic ear. When Jamie turned 8, Sarah gave birth to another daughter, Catherine, and Vincent joked that they would need to add on to the house again at this rate. But Sarah just laughed and said 4 children seemed like a good number, and Vincent secretly agreed, though he would have welcomed more if they had been blessed with them. The children grew, each one developing their own personality and interests. Jamie was serious and thoughtful, with a love of books that rivaled his mother's. Rose was bold and adventurous, always ready to explore and try new things. Henry was gentle and kind, with a special way with animals. And little Catherine was stubborn and determined, keeping her older siblings in line with a force of will that belied her small size. Vincent watched them all with pride and love, marveling at how each one was unique and precious. He taught the boys to ride and work cattle, while Sarah taught Rose and Catherine to read and cook and tend the garden. But they were careful not to limit the children by gender, letting Rose ride out with her father and brothers when she wanted, and encouraging the boys to learn their way around the kitchen. When Jamie was 14, a young man with growing awareness of the world beyond the ranch, he asked Vincent about how he and Sarah had met. They were working together repairing fence line, and Vincent paused in his work, wiping sweat from his forehead, and told his son the whole story. He talked about seeing Sarah kneeling in the dust behind the mercantile in Fort Stockton, breaking her last piece of bread to feed a starving dog. He described how something in that act had moved him so deeply that he could not walk away, how he had taken them both in without words, because sometimes words were insufficient for what needed to be done. "I knew in that moment that your mother was someone special," Vincent said quietly, meeting his son's eyes. "Someone who would show kindness even when she had nothing left to give. That is the kind of person you want in your life, son. Someone with compassion and courage and strength." Jamie nodded thoughtfully, absorbing his father's words. "Is that what love is, then? Recognizing something good in someone and deciding to hold on to it?" "That is how it starts," Vincent agreed. "But love grows over time. It is built through shared experiences and challenges overcome together. Your mother and I have been through a lot in the years since that day. Good times and hard times, and every experience has deepened what we feel for each other. Love is not just a moment, son. It is a lifetime of moments, strung together like beads on a string." They finished their work in companionable silence, and that evening Vincent found Sarah in the kitchen preparing supper while Catherine helped by setting the table. He came up behind his wife, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What brought this on?" Sarah asked, laughing softly and leaning back against him. "I was just remembering," Vincent murmured. "That day I first saw you, how I almost did not go over, almost just loaded my wagon and left. What if I had? What if I had just driven away and never spoken to you?" Sarah turned in his arms, cupping his face in her hands. "But you did not," she said firmly. "You came over. You helped us. You changed everything. There is no point in wondering about what might have been when what is so good." Vincent kissed her then, ignoring Catherine's giggled protests about parents being mushy, and felt the same surge of love and gratitude he had felt on that day 17 years ago, when Sarah had agreed to marry him. The years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the milestones of their growing children. Jamie went off to college in Austin to study law, making his parents proud with his intelligence and dedication. Rose married a young rancher from a neighboring property, a good man who clearly adored her, and Vincent walked his daughter down the aisle with tears in his eyes. Henry decided to stay on the ranch, working alongside his father and learning the business with the intention of taking over someday. Catherine, their youngest, proved to have a gift for teaching and began helping the schoolteacher in Fort Stockton, planning to become a teacher herself. Vincent and Sarah grew older together, their hair graying and their faces lining, but the love between them never diminished. They still talked for hours in the evenings, still reached for each other in the night, still found joy in the simple fact of being together. When Vincent turned 60, Sarah organized a surprise party, inviting neighbors and friends from all over the area. Their children and grandchildren gathered, for by then Jamie had married and had 2 children of his own, and Rose had 3 little ones. The house was filled with laughter and music, and the chaos of multiple generations celebrating together. Thomas Wade, now an old man himself but still running his ranch with the help of his sons, raised a glass in toast. "To Vincent Morgan," he said loudly, and the room quieted. "One of the best men I have ever known. Fair in his dealings, generous in his spirit, and blessed with a family that any man would envy. May you have many more years ahead, my friend." Vincent stood to respond, his arm around Sarah's waist, and looked around at all the faces gathered in his home. His children and grandchildren, his neighbors and friends, all the connections and relationships that made up a life well lived. And at the center of it all was Sarah, his wife of nearly 30 years, still beautiful to him, still the most important person in his world. "Thank you all for coming," Vincent said, his voice rough with emotion. "I am a lucky man, blessed beyond measure, but I want you all to know that everything good in my life, all of it, started with one moment. One decision to stop and help when help was needed. One woman with a compassionate heart feeding her last piece of bread to a starving dog." He turned to Sarah, taking both her hands in his. "You saved that dog's life. You saved my life too, though I did not realize how much I needed saving until you arrived. You have given me everything I have. Our children, our home, this whole beautiful life. I love you more today than I did 30 years ago, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for staying. Thank you for making me the luckiest man alive." Sarah was crying now, tears streaming down her face, and she pulled Vincent into a tight embrace while their guests applauded and cheered. "I love you too," she whispered against his ear. "Always have, always will." The party continued late into the night, and afterward, when the guests had departed and the house was quiet again, Vincent and Sarah sat together on the porch watching the stars come out. The air was cool and pleasant, a mild evening in early spring, and from inside the house they could hear Henry talking quietly with his wife as they settled into the guest room for the night. "You ever regret it?" Vincent asked softly. "The life you might have had if things had been different? If your father had not died, if you had stayed in St. Louis?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "I do not regret any of it, even the hard parts, the struggles and losses. They led me here to you, to our family. This is the life I was meant to have. I know that in my bones." "I feel the same way," Vincent admitted. "Everything I went through, all the lonely years, they were worth it because they led me to that day in Fort Stockton when I saw you kneeling in the dust, breaking bread for a dying dog. That was the moment my real life began." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, holding hands and listening to the night sounds of the ranch. In the barn, horses stirred in their stalls. In the distance, cattle lowed softly. A coyote called somewhere out in the darkness, and another answered. "Tell me something," Sarah said eventually. "That day when you first saw me, what made you stop? Really? You said you recognized suffering, but there must have been more to it than that." Vincent thought about it, trying to put into words something he had never fully articulated even to himself. "I saw your face," he said slowly. "The way you looked at that dog with such gentleness and care. And you were smiling, even though you were crying, even though you were clearly in desperate straits yourself. You still found joy in helping something that needed help. That is rare, Sarah. That kind of goodness is rare. I could not walk away from it." "I remember seeing you standing there," Sarah said softly. "This big, rough-looking cowboy reaching down for the dog, and I thought you were going to hurt him. I almost tried to stop you. But then you looked at me, and your eyes were kind. I saw that kindness and decided to trust it. Best decision I ever made." Vincent raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "We were both lucky that day, lucky to find each other." "Lucky," Sarah echoed, and they both smiled, remembering the dog who had inadvertently brought them together. The years continued their relentless march forward, bringing new joys and new sorrows. Vincent's health began to decline in his late 60s. Nothing dramatic, but the slow accumulation of aches and pains and limitations that came with age. Sarah was still strong and active, caring for him with the same gentle devotion she had shown to that starving dog so many years ago. Henry took over more of the ranch work, running things with his father's steady wisdom and his mother's compassion. Jamie became a respected lawyer in Austin, handling cases for ranchers and farmers and regular folks who needed someone to stand up for them. Rose raised her children and helped her husband expand their ranch into one of the most successful in the area. Catherine opened her own school in Fort Stockton, teaching a new generation of children to read and think and question. Vincent and Sarah became great-grandparents, marveling at the growing family tree that had branched out from that single moment of connection decades ago. They spent their days in quiet contentment, tending Sarah's garden together, reading on the porch, taking slow walks around the property with Scout following along behind them. On their 40th wedding anniversary, their children organized another celebration, but this time it was a smaller, more intimate affair. Just family, gathered in the house that Vincent had built and expanded over the years to accommodate their growing brood. They shared a meal prepared from recipes Sarah had perfected over decades of cooking, and afterward, Vincent stood with difficulty, leaning on his cane, and cleared his throat. "I want to tell you all a story," he began, and even the youngest grandchildren quieted to listen. "It is a story about kindness and compassion, and how the smallest actions can change everything." He told them about Sarah and the dog, about Lucky, and how he had been saved, about the decision to take in a starving woman and a dying animal without question or hesitation. He talked about how that single act of mercy had led to their marriage, to their children, to all of them sitting here today. "The lesson I want you to take from this," Vincent said, looking around at all the faces, young and old, that carried pieces of him and Sarah forward into the future, is that kindness matters. Compassion matters. When you see someone or something in need, and you have the ability to help, do not hesitate. Do not calculate what it might cost you or whether you will get anything in return. Just help, because you never know what good might come from it. Jamie stood then, raising his glass. "To my parents," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The best example of love and partnership I have ever known. May we all be half as lucky as you have been." "To Vincent and Sarah," the rest of the family echoed, and the toast rang through the house, carrying with it the weight of 40 years of marriage and love and commitment. That night, lying in bed beside Sarah, Vincent felt the full weight of his years pressing down on him. His body ached in ways it never had when he was young, and he knew that the time ahead was shorter than the time behind. But he felt no regret, no wish to have lived differently. "Are you awake?" Sarah whispered in the darkness. "Yes," Vincent replied, reaching for her hand. "I was just thinking," Sarah said softly, "about how grateful I am for all of it. Every moment, every day. You gave me a life I could never have imagined, Vincent. You gave me safety and love and a family. You gave me a home." "We gave each other those things," Vincent corrected gently. "It was never just me, Sarah. We built this life together, every step of the way. I could not have done any of it without you." They lay quietly for a while, hands clasped, and Vincent found himself thinking about that day in Fort Stockton one more time. How close he had come to just loading his wagon and leaving. How easily he might have missed the most important moment of his life. "Sarah," he said into the darkness. "Yes. Thank you for feeding that dog. Thank you for being the kind of person who would give away her last piece of bread to help something that was suffering. Thank you for being you." He felt her shift in the bed, moving closer to him, and then her head was on his shoulder, her arm across his chest, holding him the way they had held each other for 40 years. "Thank you for seeing me," Sarah whispered. "Thank you for stopping. Thank you for taking us both in. Thank you for loving me. Always," Vincent promised. "Always and forever." Vincent lived to see his 75th birthday, still sharp of mind even as his body grew weaker. Sarah was with him every step of the way, refusing to let anyone else care for him, insisting that after everything they had been through together, she would not leave his side now. On a cool morning in late October, with autumn painting the Texas landscape in shades of gold and rust, Vincent woke in his own bed with Sarah beside him, just as he had for the past 43 years. The sun was streaming through the windows, and he could hear the sounds of the ranch coming to life outside. Henry's voice calling to the ranch hands, the lowing of cattle, the bark of the current generation of ranch dogs. "It is a beautiful day," Sarah said softly, and Vincent turned his head to look at her. She was 72 now, her hair completely silver, her face lined with the marks of a life well lived, but to him, she was still the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. "Every day with you has been beautiful," Vincent replied, his voice weak but sincere. Sarah took his hand, her eyes filling with tears. "Do not talk like that. You are going to be fine. You just need to rest." But Vincent knew better. He could feel it, the way his body was shutting down, preparing for the final journey. He was not afraid. He had lived a good life, a full life, surrounded by love and family and purpose. "Sarah," he said gently, squeezing her hand with what strength he had left, "listen to me. You have been the greatest blessing of my life. Every single day with you has been a gift. I want you to know that, to really know it. You made me happier than I ever deserved to be." "Do not," Sarah sobbed, climbing into the bed beside him and holding him close. "Please do not leave me. I am not ready." "You are the strongest person I know," Vincent murmured, stroking her hair with trembling fingers. "You will be all right, the children will take care of you, and I will be waiting for you when your time comes. I promise." He felt her tears soaking through his nightshirt, felt the way she clung to him, and wished he could spare her this pain. But death came for everyone eventually, and he had been lucky enough to live long enough to see his children grown and successful, to know his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, to spend decades with the woman he loved. "Tell me again," Sarah whispered brokenly. "Tell me about the day we met." So Vincent did, using the last of his strength to paint the picture one more time. The hot Texas sun, the dusty street, the woman kneeling in the dirt feeding bread to a starving dog, the decision that had changed everything. "I saw you," he whispered, his voice fading. "And I knew. Somehow I just knew. You were meant to be mine and I was meant to be yours. And I was right, Sarah. I was right." His eyes closed then, and Sarah felt the moment his breath stopped, felt his hand go slack in hers. She lay there holding him, sobbing, unable to let go even though she knew he was gone. Their children found them like that an hour later. Sarah curled around Vincent in the bed they had shared for so many years, refusing to move, refusing to accept that the man who had been her partner and love and best friend was truly gone. But eventually, gently, they coaxed her out of the room, and Henry took charge of the arrangements while Jamie sent word to his siblings and the neighbors. They buried Vincent on a hill overlooking the ranch he had built, under a spreading oak tree with a view of the valley below, and it seemed like half of Texas turned out for the funeral. People spoke about Vincent's kindness and integrity, his fairness in business dealings, his devotion to his family. But it was Sarah's words that everyone remembered, standing at the graveside with her children and grandchildren gathered around her, speaking in a clear, strong voice despite her grief. "Vincent saved my life," she said simply. "I was starving and alone, feeding my last piece of bread to a dying dog, and he took us both in without question. He gave me safety and love and a family and a home. He gave me 43 years of happiness. He was the best man I have ever known, and I will love him until the day I die and beyond." Sarah lived another 8 years after Vincent's death, spending her final years surrounded by family, tending her garden, teaching her great-grandchildren to read, and keeping Vincent's memory alive through stories and love. She never remarried, never even considered it, because as she told anyone who asked, she had already had her great love and did not need another. When her own time finally came, on a spring morning with flowers blooming in the garden she had nurtured for decades, Sarah died peacefully in her sleep in the house Vincent had built for her. They buried her beside him on the hill under the oak tree, and on her tombstone, Henry had carved a simple inscription: "She fed a starving dog and saved us all." The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through Henry's line, and the story of Vincent and Sarah became a legend of sorts, told and retold to each new generation. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren grew up hearing about the day their grandfather saw a woman feeding bread to a starving dog and decided to take them both in, about how that single act of compassion had created a legacy of love and family that stretched forward into the future. And every so often, when one of the children asked why the story was so important, why it mattered so much, their parents would repeat the words Vincent had spoken so many years ago. Kindness matters. Compassion matters. When you see someone or something in need, and you have the ability to help, do not hesitate. Just help, because you never know what good might come from it. The oak tree on the hill grew larger over the years, its branches spreading wide to shade the two graves beneath it. In the summer, wildflowers bloomed around the markers, planted by descendants who wanted to honor the couple who had started it all. And on quiet evenings, when the wind blew through the valley and rustled the leaves of the oak tree, it almost sounded like laughter, like two voices joined together in joy and love, and the perfect contentment of a life well lived together. The Morgan Ranch continued to prosper, generation after generation, built on the foundation of hard work and integrity that Vincent had established, and the compassion and strength that Sarah had embodied. The house was expanded again and again to accommodate growing families, but the original rooms, the kitchen where Vincent and Sarah had eaten their meals together, the bedroom where their children had been born, and where they had spent their final days, were preserved and maintained with reverent care. Jamie's son, another Vincent, followed his grandfather into ranching rather than law, and he proved to have the same instinct for the land and animals that his namesake had possessed. Rose's children spread out across Texas, starting their own ranches and businesses, but always maintaining the family connections, gathering every year for reunions where the stories were told again, and the legacy was reinforced. Catherine, who had never married, devoted her life to education, and by the time she was an old woman, she had taught hundreds of children to read and think and dream. She always kept a picture of her parents on her desk, and whenever a student seemed to be struggling or needed encouragement, she would tell them the story of how her mother had given away her last piece of bread to feed a starving dog, and how one act of kindness had created a ripple effect that touched countless lives. Henry ran the ranch until he was too old to ride anymore, and then his son took over, and then his grandson. The cycle continued, each generation adding their own chapter to the family story, but always returning to that original moment, that foundational act of compassion that had made everything else possible. 100 years after that day in Fort Stockton, when Vincent Morgan saw a woman feeding bread to a starving dog and decided to take them both in, his great-great-grandchildren still lived on the land he had worked. The ranch had grown and changed, incorporating new technologies and methods, but the core values remained the same: hard work, integrity, compassion, family. The house had been renovated multiple times, but the family always insisted on keeping the original structure intact, and visitors could still see the bedroom where Vincent and Sarah had slept, the kitchen where they had shared meals, the porch where they had sat in the evenings talking and dreaming and planning their future. And on the hill under the oak tree, now ancient and gnarled but still standing strong, The graves of Vincent and Sarah Morgan remained a place of pilgrimage for family members seeking connection to their past and inspiration for their future. Someone always kept fresh flowers on the graves, and the inscriptions on the tombstones, worn by time but still legible, continued to tell their story to anyone who took the time to read them. Vincent Morgan, the stones read, 1850–1925. Beloved husband, father, grandfather. He saw need and answered with kindness. Sarah Morgan, 1859–1933. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother. She fed a starving dog and saved us all. The story of Vincent and Sarah became more than just family history. It became a legend in Fort Stockton and the surrounding area, a reminder of the power of compassion and the unexpected ways that lives could intertwine. Schools taught it as an example of the values that had built Texas. Churches used it as an illustration of putting faith into action. Families passed it down as a blueprint for how to live a good and meaningful life. And somewhere, in whatever comes after, Vincent and Sarah were together still, holding hands and watching over the family they had created, proud of every generation that carried their legacy forward, grateful for that moment in the dust behind a mercantile in Fort Stockton when their eyes had met and everything had changed. The love story that had begun with a woman feeding bread to a starving dog and a cowboy taking them both in without a word had echoed across generations, a testament to the truth that the most important moments in life are often the simplest ones, the quiet acts of kindness that change everything. Their story had proven that love built on compassion and mutual respect and genuine partnership could weather any storm and create a legacy that would endure long after both lovers were gone. And that, in the end, was the greatest gift Vincent and Sarah gave to their descendants. Not just the ranch or the land or the material prosperity, but the example of how to love well, how to build a life together, how to extend kindness to those in need without expectation of reward. They showed that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply stop when you see someone struggling and offer help, because you never know what beautiful things might grow from that single seed of compassion.